Hi, I'm Ylli from the Special Competitive Studies Project. In this week's Memos to the President, I want to rebroadcast the conversation I had last week with Dylan Patel from SemiAnalysis. Last week, Special Competitive Studies Project organized a one-day summit on AI plus compute and advanced network. And I sat down with Dylan to talk about the future of AI, the future of chips, and I hope you'll enjoy my conversation with him. I think this is it, right? You want to do this? Whatever you want, Dylan.
Sure.
Very informal, family and friends. Dylan, it's so great to have you here. Good afternoon, everybody. So for those of you that don't know, I'll ask Dylan to introduce him and the company that he runs quickly. But for those of us that have been in this industry and following the semiconductor world, Dylan really had, from early on, one of the best newsletters, SemiAnalysis, but since then he has built an incredible company. So Dylan, welcome to the SCSP event, and please, do you want to introduce what you're doing right now?
Yeah, sure. So we have a research and consulting firm based in the US, but in all over the world, US, Taiwan, Japan, Singapore, France, et cetera. And we do research and consulting around the semiconductor supply chain, the data center supply chain, and yeah, broadly those areas. We work with sort of hyperscalers, semiconductor companies, et cetera, right? And that's the main focus, but tends to be there's a newsletter which everyone reads, which is fun. Yeah.
Yeah. So for those of you that don't subscribe, please subscribe to Dylan's newsletter after you subscribe to SCSP's newsletter. But let's have a really informal conversation because there were so many good conversations today here, Dylan. Some on the current issues, some on the future issues. You track all these issues really carefully, and you have incredible insights. So let's start with first, the last 48 hours since the State of the Union, a lot of debate about the CHIPS Act. Your thoughts on where is this going, and why is this getting so much attention?
Yes, I mean, the CHIPS Act is very well-meaning, right? It's required. Obviously, $52 billion is just a drop in the bucket, right? It is nowhere close to enough to, in my view, to get the U.S. to even 20% of global production, let alone a higher number, which is what we'd like, going back to maybe the 80s levels, right? 30s even percentages or 40 percentage points. And so this is a real big challenge. As far as what happens with the CHIPS Act, that's up for debate / we're not sure. Sounds like it's being rebranded or even killed. But what's clear is the U.S. needs a secure semiconductor supply chain. Even with TSMC's announcement, even if they do it, right, and it'll take them to like 2030, 31 to spend that much money and build the fabs and et cetera. Most of it after this administration's gone, because all of the fab shell is built less than 20% of the cost, takes a couple of years, and then the equipment gets moved in. So you're going to see all this equipment move in the next administration mostly, at which point, do they just tear up the deal, right? And so, and even if they do fully do the full $100 billion they commit to, completely still reliant on R&D in Taiwan. The R&D fab they announced is not going to secure R&D supply chain, right? It's not going to secure new node development, right? It's still less than 30% of their capacity. It doesn't have many nodes. It's still not making America's chip supply chain secure. But it's a good step in the right direction. So we'll see what happens with that, right? And
right.
What can actually be done to accelerate a domestic supply chain.
Right. I was in Taiwan last week, visited TSMC and UMC, and there's a lot, obviously, nervousness there. Not just what's going to happen around semiconductors, the future of legacy chips, the China, the Taiwan writ large, and U.S. policies towards Taiwan. You mentioned TSMC's announcement on the investment. There are some other announcements that are being either prepared or they're happening. There's the Intel corner, the Qualcomm, TSMC investments. How do you see the landscape right now?
So I think we should really focus on where America can win, right? So Taiwan, for example, is, TSMC is already approaching 20% of power consumption in Taiwan. And if they were to continue to build out what we expect them to build out in the next 4 or 5 years, it's going to get to 30, 40%. Meanwhile, they're turning off all their nuclear power. Over the next 18 months, they have a humongous percentage of GE Vernova's dual combined cycle gas plants being shipped there. And they have to import LNG, right, from the US primarily. This is great, but their power costs are 3-4x that of the US. And fabs take a lot of power, right? Even Intel's Ohio fab, which is relatively small on the grand scheme of TSMC's fabs in like Hsinchu and Taichung and now Arizona, right? Quite small, actually, Ohio is. That's gigawatt scale, right? Like these things are not small, and the U.S. can actually win by providing super cheap power. Most of the cost of the fab is the equipment, right? 80% that costs the same no matter where you are, right? Flying an EUV tool from Eindhoven to Taiwan versus US. So I think there's a lot of things that can be done to equalize on cost and make us win. And actually, hey, yes, we do pay our people more, but our power is so much cheaper. Let's exploit that advantage. And we can actually make America economic to build all the fabs in, right? Or not all of them, but like a higher percentage. And I think that's the real hope, is that we can sort of accelerate and drive to win. Now, obviously, there's a lot of studies out there that U.S. is slower to build fabs, and we can do stuff to accelerate that.
And the issue of workforce.
Workforce, permitting, all these things are challenges.
Right.
Immigration,
Yeah, absolutely. We had an incredible panel with Alan Estevez from BIS, former BIS earlier. Let's talk about the diffusive rule a little bit. Where do you think that's going to go in this administration based on your prediction?
Right, so the diffusion rule is like quite a challenge, right? You put like Portugal in the same bucket as like, Singapore, who are both like, generally, Singapore's a military ally to some, as the same bucket as Yemen, right? And it's like, countries are very mad. It is sort of on a silver platter handed to the Trump administration to do some deals, right? Hey, if you go follow through with this, you tweak it. Like India, you want to be tier 1 country, you actually want to build out these data centers, right? That you've started planning. Maybe like stop buying Russian military equipment and buy some F-35s, right? Like I feel like deals like this can be done, but at the end of the day, right?
Poland is really also.
GPUs and AI are the capital good that creates, or that can create intelligence and human factor labor, right? Like there's a lot of GDP growth that can come from intelligence, and I think that the substrate for that is compute, and limiting it is obviously very. It's like spitting on your allies, right? If you limit it to them, or spitting on countries that are in the middle ground, right, between the U.S. and China. And so this has a lot of geopolitical ramifications. I don't know that much about geopolitics, to be clear. What I do know is
Washington, so you should know everything now.
The thing that I think is like pretty clear though is that like there's like this false narrative that if we do limit with the diffusion rules that China will now take over this compute market. And while the equipment restrictions on China are very poor, like Swiss cheese, there's still a ton that flies through the restrictions. China does not have the capacity to, their natural amount of compute they should have is like, what, a third, right? In 2022, they imported roughly 40% of the A100s, right? This is pre-Chat GPT. Now we fast forward to today, over 70% of GPUs are going to America, right? So what happens, what's the natural state? Well, they should have 40% of flops maybe, and America should have like 40%, right, in a sort of status quo. And diffusion rules are aimed at making sure that this stays, 70% America and much less for China. The question is like, I guess how can we effectively do this without blowing up allies? And China taking over these foreign markets is like erroneous because they can't produce enough for their domestic market even, let alone to export, and they won't be able to build enough for this year or next year. Now, long term, if AI doesn't take off, right, like many people in the tech industry, like myself, I'm not wearing a suit, so clearly not in the tech, not in DC world. There's the question of like, can China take, is diffusion going to slow down America in the long term? And if AI doesn't take off, then obviously AI diffusion is like a policy mishap because people are going to be closer to China in 3 to 5 years, right? If AI doesn't like build these leverage, this exponential growth that everyone is pushing for.
Yeah. You touched a little bit on the equipment. What is your assessment on the effectiveness of export controls, both on the equipment side and on the hardware side?
So it's an absolute fact that China's been slowed down massively, right? SMIC, CXMT, these companies would be much further ahead and have much more capacity if it weren't for the restrictions, whether it be HBM, whether it be leading edge silicon, whether it be shrinking to 5 nanometer and beyond. So they've absolutely been effective. The challenge has been that there have been enough loopholes in there, enough ways to Swiss cheese through it, all these holes, that they've still been able to advance, right? And China has fantastic engineering capabilities and tons of money to pour into this. So they're going to advance. The question is just how big can the gap be? And if restrictions need to get a lot better on equipment before they get better on chips to some extent, right? Because I mentioned natural state is maybe 40% China of AI compute, and they're much lower than that today. In effect, they have been the restrictions have been quite effective on chips, even though there's all these problems with the H20 and smuggling and so on and so forth. On equipment, though, right? Last year, ASML, many quarters, they've had 45% of their equipment and even more of their revenue come from China. And likewise for ASML, Lam Research, and all these companies, right? I think a lot of this is because the equipment restrictions are so technical, and the only people to talk to on these restrictions generally tends to be the industry. And the industry is obviously benefiting from loopholes with 45% of their revenue coming from China. And so at my firm, I have someone who worked at ASML on the reticle. I have someone who worked at Lam Research. We have a lot of technical capabilities, but it takes so much to explain to any one regulator. And we don't have a ton of conversations with policymakers, but when we do, it's you have to end up having conversations with 10 different people, and then there's a smosh garb of 100 people that are actually involved, and it gets diluted, and then there ends up being some loophole, or there's some technicality where, okay, you can still ship equipment, and it's this is the problem, and if you don't limit equipment properly, then yes, they are just going to take over, they're going to be able to accelerate their chip production industry, design chips, AI chips, et cetera, right? But if you limit equipment properly, right, so that they can only make this level of chip, and then you allow companies from the US sell maybe this level of chip, so then you end up retaining the China market / slowing down their internal efforts because they can't catch up to what the West can sell them. And they can't export to the foreign world what the West will sell them, right? And so I think that's the correct strategy, and right now we've kind of got it flipped, right? Which is that China can make chips better with the equipment we'll sell them than the chips will sell them, right? And now of course, there's still some catching up. Huawei is still, the 910B is still behind the H20. The 910C will look to be more closely matched coming out this year, right, in volume, but there is that gap, and this is not the correct policy to have.
Right. Talking about China catching up, a lot of conversations today about DeepSeek. I know you wrote at length about DeepSeek. Can you give us sort of the summary of your opinion of what happened there?
Yeah. So there's an element of the closed labs in the U.S. having a number of these technologies, not all of them, right? DeepSeek generally being very good at engineering, and then inventing a few new techniques, right? It's a wake-up call, of course. But when we look at hey, what is Meta doing? What's xAI doing? What's OpenAI and Anthropic doing? They're not leaps and bounds ahead. Yes, they did it with a lot less GPUs, right? Although the numbers of GPUs that they claim they have is false. They have more than that. They have significantly more GPUs than they claim.
How much they have?
The estimates that we have is so first of all, ads in China,
I know.
They say they have tens of thousands of GPUs
right.
for researchers, right? And it's why are we pretending their number is real when they say in ads for researchers, hey, come work here, we have tens of thousands of GPUs, right? There's this silly stuff like this. They have a 25 megawatt colo in Shanghai that is completely full from GDS. I think they rebranded to pretend they're not they moved to Shanghai and rebranded to pretend they're not a Chinese company, or not Shanghai, sorry, Singapore. But anyways, they have a 25 megawatt colo that's full. That's enough for if you were to say H20s, that's enough for something like 25K H20s, right? So they have a lot more GPUs than they claim, and they have other colos besides that. So the thing is, though, right? Building intelligence, training a model is one thing. It's harder to restrict their ability to train a model. What's more important is you don't get economic value from building a model. You get economic value from deploying a model, right? And if you're not able to deploy a model, what is the value of this training, right? And so, like, yes, everyone's, there's always the argument of, like, what's the economic rationale for building these crazy clusters? Well, it's like GPT-4, right, 20,000 GPUs, A100s. In 2022, they released the model in 23, they get to multi-billion dollars of revenue from it, right? But it took time, and to get to that multi-billion dollars of revenue, they actually had to deploy way, way, way more GPUs for inference than they did training. And that's where the productivity growth comes from. That's where the value for humanity, the economy, et cetera, comes from, is deploying the models, right? Now, you have to make the upfront investment, but the number of GPUs dedicated to inference, especially with test time compute, is going to be much, much larger than the ones for training. So we can try and restrict training, and people will always argue, oh, the restrictions are not working because they're able to build models that are close, right, 6 months behind, a year behind, but they won't be able to deploy them efficiently. And once we get to that cycle of, hey, GDP growth is actually accelerating because of AI, military capabilities are actually accelerating because of AI, that's when it really matters that they're restricted in their ability to deploy models, right? Because they'll always be able to concentrate compute at a higher level than America, right? We have so many companies competing in this AGI race, right? Whereas China, while they do have multiple companies, they can concentrate, they can build a bigger data center than us because we have a lot of issues on power, a lot of issues on industrial capacity. So they can be competitive on models, right? Without a doubt. But they won't be able to deploy them if we effectively limit compute.
Right. Obviously, new administration. If you would advise the President Trump right now, what are the key things that you would need to invest and build the next 4 years, which I consider will be the next 4 years in terms of either we will see really transformative models close to AGI, if not AGI. What would be some of the elements you would think we should invest in the infrastructure to get us there?
Yeah, so the first thing is, was meeting with some secretaries yesterday in energy and interior, and the thing with a client of mine, and we were pitching, hey, FERC has a lot of issues, right? There's a lot of problems on energy policy, right? The U.S. can't build power. A lot of the localized grid companies, utility companies, are limiting the ability to deploy power, even in like Louisiana or like Oklahoma, which is like, you'd think Republican governors with a lot of energy assets in both of those, like natural gas and stuff. The grids are, the utility companies are limiting the production of energy, right? And the amount of power that these data centers are, sort of throwing up. We track one of the data sets that we, you build and consult with is we track all the data centers in the U.S. and outside of China actually, and like when they come online and such. There is a over 40 gigawatt hole in power for the U.S. Even if we don't turn off any more coal. In fact, we restart some. We take all the natural gas dual combined cycle reactor deliveries that we're going to have. We still have, and you add in renewables, you have a 40 gigawatt hole of power production in the US. And that's because things are held up by air permits, by utilities, not allowing transmission challenges. So there's a lot of grid stuff that, like, yes, there's that executive order that Biden did in the last weeks, and then Trump sort of did a variation of it. This is not enough, right? Like, data centers need to be designated critical infrastructure. There needs to be some fast lane to allowing power and data centers to be built without going through all of the regulations. State regulations need to be bypassed somehow. Utility companies need to be forced aside somehow to let people build behind the meter power. The power is truly the biggest challenge, right? And America hasn't built power in any significant volume in many years. And now we're going to have to skyrocket in power. We have to relearn that muscle. Right. And so there's a lot of policy around that I think is just like, hey, we can win in America.
Mm-hmm. I think you mentioned earlier one statement that I've heard you say it before about China. And if China was serious about getting to AGI, they would get there. Can you explain a little bit your hypothesis and why they're not doing that? Yeah,
so we're talking about models today that are trained on 100,000 GPUs, right? And they're just coming out, right, with GPT 4.5 and Grok 3, and you'll see more and more coming. And next generation models that are trained on hundreds of thousands or even million GPUs, right, that cost tens of billions of dollars, right? Great. China, NVIDIA made over 4 million GPUs last year. They're making over 7 million this year, right? High-end data center GPUs. And then you add on like AMD and all these other companies, you add on TPUs and all these custom ASICs that Google and Amazon and so on and so forth are making. China is importing more than enough GPUs, right? Just in Q3, Q4, and the early part of Q1 this year, they imported 1 million H20s, right? This is more than enough if they even took 30% of it, concentrated it, to be a bigger cluster than any American company has, right? If they wanted to, and then as far as like building a data center and powering it, they can do that like that, right? They have so many sites where they have all the grid substation connected. You could take like the 3rd largest aluminum mill in China, turn it off, put GPUs in it, right? The substation's already there. It's pretty. I won't say it's simple, but they could do this. Elon built his cluster in an old factory in like 6 months. I'm telling you, China could do it faster, right? As good as Elon is, and he did in Memphis, Tennessee. They can do this. They can get a bigger cluster than America. They have the talent, right? There's no way you should underestimate China. They just haven't done it because they don't believe in AI the way that like sort of, I'll say cultist, but I'm part of the AI cult as well to some extent, right? The cultist in like America sort of believe in AI, right? Now the difference is I think AI is DeepSeek really did wake up China, right? Like Lian Wenfeng and Huawei and all these other folks met with the vice chairman, and then the week later they met Xi. Like they are making big moves now. So is it possible that they decide, okay, we're actually going to build a bigger cluster than America? Then we're going to have better AI than America. We can limit them on deploying it, but we're not going to be able to limit them on building it, right? This year. And now, obviously, that doesn't get you to AGI. The biggest cluster doesn't. There's a lot of sort of work to get there, but it's a concentration thing. And the U.S. we're more decentralized, which is our strength, right? But China can use their strength of being more centralized, right?
Last question, Dylan. Amazing conversation. Who gets there first, U.S. or China?
I think it'll be a lot closer than most people think. I don't think there's like one specific hallmark that will be there, right? Many people will call things, there, right? Like you go talk to GPT-4 10 years ago, people are like, this is AGI, right? But I think like, I think it's going to be a lot of sort of multi-agent systems that get you there, and I don't think one individual company gets there. I think America will win. I think we're going to be more innovative. I think we'll solve a lot of these problems on data center and power, and we'll be able to deploy it more broadly, and our economy will be able to find more use cases for it. But I think it's going to be a sort of, the models are going to compete with each other, right? Just like a child in isolation doesn't learn as much as a child in, competition with other children, right? Learns a lot more, competition and collaboration. I think models will be like this, right? The OpenAI model will compete with the Anthropic model, will compete with the XAI model, Google model, et cetera, in the economy, and they'll learn from each other. They'll have recursion, self-improvement. These are machine learning research problems that are not solved yet, but all of this will sort of, I think our system of economy will allow us to win.
And just one last question. Who do you think is the third player in this space? I mean, US, China, who is the third player that is going to emerge? It's emerging, it's investing. I mean, we talked a lot today about UAE. Obviously, Great Britain has a lot of companies, ecosystem. France has emerged lately as like the center of open source. But based on your analysis, who is the third player in the space?
So I truly think there is no third player on all aspects, right? If you look at individual aspects, yes, there can be a third player, right? Like France building more than 1 gigawatt of data center capacity. That's like really nothing compared to the tens of gigawatts that America's building and China can build the moment they decide to. And in fact, they're already building like 5+ gigawatts of data center capacity. Same with the Middle East, right? They can leverage their power, they can build data centers, but they don't have the talent, right? As far as France, they do have AI talent, but a lot of it works for American companies. Same with the UK, right? DeepMind is, I guess, a UK company, but it's an American company, right? And so, because it's Google, right? Likewise, I think like sovereign AI efforts in like India and Indonesia and places like this are there's gonna be a long tail of like useful work, but I don't necessarily think anyone is in the AGI race besides the US and China.
Right. On that note, Dylan, please join me in thanking Dylan for his incredible insights and subscribe to his newsletter, SemiAnalysis. Thank you. Thanks, Dylan.